speaking to a friend yesterday about West Ham was really interesting. He loves football, but he doesn't support any of the big teams. Well, in fact, he hates the Premier League. He hates what football has become. Still loves football, loves the grassroots stuff, does coaching at grassroots level, goes and watches Aldershot. But, you know, in terms of the big stuff and the Sky Sports stuff, just forget it. So anyway, he was asking me what's going on with West Ham. So I started explaining, well, you know, difficult start to the season, so on. We just got a win, but there's a lot of frustration between the fans and the board, so it's very much sort of bored out at the moment. And he said to me, well, aren't you always bored out there? And it was an interesting one. And he said, what's the difference? And it just made me think, I think there's two main differences now. Number one is that the media seem to be catching on, which Gio discussed yesterday. But even after Gio's video, there is still more stuff that's happened. And the other thing is Daniel Kretinsky. So I do understand there'll be a lot of people watching this who will be thinking, well, hold on a second, we've had all this before. We had it with Brown out, Terence Brown, who was our previous chairman, the bond scheme. But we can talk about that, and it would seem that West Ham have just always been cursed with bad ownership. That's the way it seems anyway. But I want to concentrate on the current ownership at the moment. Really, what's the difference between what will be the protests now at the Crystal Palace game and the difference between the protests that we've had before? And I do think the two main things are media seem more behind it now. And the other thing is Daniel Kretinsky. I think Daniel Kretinsky is a real important factor in this because he wasn't a factor before because he didn't have ownership. So beforehand, by protesting or marching or whatever the case may be, you were only really able to apply quite limited pressure because, of course, back then you had David Sullivan, Karen Brady, David Gold. They were very united, they were very unified, and ironically Terence Brown is still a minor shareholder at West Ham. You could apply a certain amount of pressure, but you didn't feel that there was anyone with any great shareholding who was going to turn around and say, well, hold on, what the hell is going on here? I think, in essence, if Sullivan, Gold and Brady could survive the heat and the scrutiny, then they were never going to be forced to do anything that they didn't want to do. Do they like the bad publicity? No, but I don't feel they got much of it. We've spoken here before about when we had the march, the planned march, which was then cancelled. And there was, I don't know, there were 2,000-3,000 people by the Aquatic Centre before the game against Burnley where it all kicked off. But the mainstream media only reported that there were a few hundred. And it wasn't the case. There were a few thousand. This time I do believe it will be different. I do believe that the mainstream media will report accurately. And I'll explain why. Because they just seem to get it and they just seem to understand. There seems to be an understanding within the mainstream media that the West Ham board are doing a bad job. Now, that could be any number of things. Maybe, it was interesting listening to Alan Brazil this morning. So there was Alan Brazil was on TalkSport. Mark Carlo went on to TalkSport, did a really, really good job on there of calmly explaining what was wrong with West Ham. And I don't think it's easy with Alan Brazil. I certainly don't think it's easy with Gabby Agbonlahor, but Mark did a really, really good job there. But what Alan Brazil said was really quite telling because he said, I've been to the stadium a number of times. It's miles from the pitch. Well, I think that's quite key. Because that's another area of separation from the protest before. People have had a period of time to go to the London Stadium. So now you've got members of the media who have been there countless times who think, well, actually, this is a million miles away from the pitch. This is, by all intents and purposes, an athletic stadium that West Ham are playing football in. So I think that in itself is important. And I just think that given enough time, enough people see that, you're not going to get the pushback from the media on that. So there's almost an immediate acceptance that West Ham are not in a great football stadium. And I think it gets voted the worst stadium in the Premier League every single year. I think that's what the London Stadium does. Now, this all helps, I think, as far as upward pressure on the board is concerned, because they didn't have... I've always thought the board don't really care what West Ham fans think in terms of the West Ham media, but they've often cared what the Match of the Day fan thinks, what the person that listens to TalkSport might think, what the person that listens to Sky Sports might think. I think that bothers them. Well, Karen Brady certainly has got externally a well-cultivated image because she does The Apprentice and stuff like that. You couldn't say David Sullivan has a well-cultivated image. He just doesn't. It comes from not a background that would lend itself to people being, wanting to attach themselves to him, if you know what I mean. But I think now the media are more predicated towards pushing against whatever comes out from the club. I think there certainly was a time before where you'd get someone like Jim White would almost repeat anything that was said by the club. This is different. The headline in the Telegraph yesterday was, I should have pulled it up, I don't have it on screen, sorry, it was West Ham Civil War. West Ham Civil War. Oh, wow, that's strong. That's a really, really strong headline. I don't think that headline would have existed before. Also, when I turned on Sky Sports News this morning, early in the morning, turned on Sky Sports News, had my morning cup of tea, I sit on the sofa and just have a little look. They were talking about the letter yesterday from the FAB. And if you haven't seen the letter, go and check it out. It's absolutely everywhere. It's a letter of no confidence from basically a collective of supporters groups issuing a vote of no confidence against the board. That in itself is a good, well, I'm not, you can decide yourself if it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I like the way they've done it, and I like the way Hammers United have done what they've done. We'll get onto that in a minute. But probably the better than the actual issuing of the letter of no confidence and the vote of no confidence is Sky Sports News reporting it today. So this is big, right? So that changes. Now, I found the wording of the Telegraph article Civil War to be really, really interesting because, well, you know what civil war means, right? Civil war would indicate, civilian war. Insiders turning on themselves, infighting, basically. I think what the Telegraph meant, and reading through the article, was West Ham fans have turned against the board. Well, that's fine. You can use that to mean civil war, but I think it can actually mean something else. And I mean actually very much an internal one and one at board level, because I don't think Daniel Kretinsky is going to like this one little bit. I don't want to talk too much about Trip Smith, but I do think he's a factor in this because, as we've talked about before, he is a broker, and a broker of takeovers and acquisitions, but he only has a small percentage. But very much Daniel Kretinsky is not going to be like David Sullivan, because he is going to care what the perception of him is. I can't pretend to have spent any length of time looking at what the perception of Kretinsky was in terms of his buyout of the Royal Mail. I don't know, but PR is going to play some part. I heard enough from him of pledging to carry on the service as it is, to look after the staff. There was enough from him for me to think, okay, Kretinsky probably does care about PR. He's not going to like this at all. And one of the things I really liked was both the letter of no confidence and what Hammers United have asked for has included Daniel Kretinsky. Now, I can't help but think that all of this is really well designed to get Daniel Kretinsky's attention, because that is key. Because whilst before I feel Brady and Sullivan could ignore the external noise, now if they have someone internally saying, what the hell is this? That's very, very different. Because Kretinsky's got money invested in however many hundreds of millions he has invested in West Ham. His heart, he's going to be a businessman. He's not going to want to see mobilised, upset customers and his shareholding value decreasing. That's just, it's not going to be something that he wants. What I really appreciate, though, about the moves from the last two is I feel that they are realistic. And I feel that there is a realistic expectation from them. And that realistic expectation is, we want you to resign your executive positions. The realism is there, and I think you've got to attack this realistically. So a lot of the stuff before was very much get them out, walk away from the club, sell up. That's going to be difficult. That's going to be difficult to do. I think, well, the first one's impossible, which is walk away. They're not going to walk away. They're not going to walk away from hundreds of millions of pounds. They're not going to do that. That's unrealistic. Sell up, well, maybe if there's an offer there. One thing we do know is the gold shares have been available for a long time now and no one's buying them. Nobody is buying those shares. Now, there is a little contradiction to you coming to the conclusion from that nobody is interested in anything to do with West Ham because somebody has just bought into the West Ham ladies team for £55 million. So clearly the name of the club is not tarnished to that extent. But as things stand, nobody wants to buy the Gold family shares. So I think this assumption is just somebody there who David Sullivan could just sell up to and walk away. That's not going to be there anyway. So I like the realistic demand, which is we want you to resign your day-to-day running of the club. We understand you're not going to sell your shares, but we don't want you to have anything to do with it. And look, go and look at the reasons yourself. The reasons are vast. We've covered them on this channel extensively. There are enough reasons to demand and to suggest and insist that the running of the club is not being done on a professional basis. Certainly the 10-point plan or whatever it is, the pledge that was made when we left Upton Park with Stratford, they've not been able to match it. They really haven't. And one of the things that I really liked, particularly on yesterday's letter, was I like the fact that they included the likes of Bournemouth and Brighton and clubs like that. The fact that they have overtaken us on and off the pitch. And this is something, if you remember, I've been talking about it for a long, long time, but go back to my video that I did when on Bournemouth's training ground compared to West Ham's training ground. And I thought that was really symbolic. It just showed the chasm between the running of the two clubs. And it's about getting somebody else in who can run it professionally. And that should be enough. Because the fact that we are constantly pleading poverty is in itself an admission of failure on the board's part. Because the whole reasoning for moving to the London Stadium was to ring fence us from that. That was meant to enable us to compete with the elite. And it hasn't. We're not. In many respects, we're further away. What seemed like a good deal at the time in terms of the rent, low peppercorn rent, is actually turned out to be, rather than an advantage, has turned out to be a disadvantage because we can't, well, we've tried. We cannot sell naming rights. Even if we do, we don't get much of the money. And realistically, the stadium is so skint, it's barely able to afford the necessary repairs on it. That's why you've got temporary stands on scaffolding, because actually the promised retractable seating is not there. I've no doubt, had the original promises have been made that actually you could have moved a whole lot very close to the pitch, it'd be a completely different match day experience. But we're not. It never happened. The running track is still there. It's just covered by a carpet. You are miles away from the pitch, and one of the reasons that we're not able to, engineer this high-tech solution to the engineering problem that you have with the stadium is, once again, because the stadium is skint. But our slim peppercorn rent is of detriment to us. So, and it's really creaking. The stadium is really showing its age now, because I know I repeat myself, and I've said this a number of times. It's really, really important to remember that stadium, the bottom of it is concrete. That's why it's dug into the ground. The top of it is a temporary structure. After the Olympics, that whole top of the stadium was meant to be taken down, and it was meant to be converted into a 25,000-seater athletic stadium. Basically, the top of it that's there wasn't meant to be there. It wasn't meant to stand the test of time. That's why it's rusting, creaking, leaking. It was never meant to be there. This structure was never supposed to be a 60,000, 65,000-seater football stadium. Anything that's been done subsequently after the Olympics has been a sticking plaster, and again, is not going to stand a test of time and is not going to last. So I think, I'm going off a tangent here, but it's hard for me to discuss this stuff and not talk about the stadium. But my point is, the move to Stratford was meant to insulate us from being skint. It was meant to give us the necessary finances to compete with the top clubs. We're nowhere near. Nowhere near. And that's why I like this. And I like the way it's being done by Hammers United and by the Fans Advisory Board, because I think there's a cerebral way of doing it, and there are realistic expectations, and without the aggressive connotations and overtones that are basically attached to other things. And I think this is the way you're going to do it. 'Cause if you do it like that, I think two things. I think number one, you're going to get Kretinsky to stand up and take notice. And number two, you're going to get the media to take notice and get behind it as well. And that's why this stuff is really, really important. And that's why you're constantly getting Hammers United saying, we're liaising with the Metropolitan Police. This is a peaceful protest. All this stuff is very, very important, actually. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit too early for me to, say, oh, I think this is definitely going to work or anything like that. I don't know. It might have no impact at all, but it feels different. This early stage, it feels different. And we've seen the media coming around. I think the biggest chip is yet to, the hand of cards, the biggest card is yet to be played here, and that is Kretinsky. And I think that may be the thing that possibly forces the hand here. Because the other thing with this is we want somebody to take over basically the day-to-day running and the executive position. And this is something that happens with a lot of the clubs. So Sheikh Mansour runs Manchester City, or he owns Manchester City. He doesn't run it. I can't even remember the guy, but there's a team that run it. He doesn't run it. He barely goes to games, actually. So they have employed a management structure to run the club. I think I'm mindful not to talk about football clubs I don't know. I think Fenway Group don't overly get involved in the day-to-day running of Liverpool. I think, again, there is a group, non-executive board members who do that. This is what West Ham need, which will beg the question of who can we get to do that? And the truth of the matter is, I don't know. I've often wanted there to be a sort of it's probably too late now, but I've said for a few years I would have liked West Ham to have got David Dean years ago and put him on the board, because I just think he's a wise old head with an excellent contact book. But we don't have to know. You don't have to know. I don't have to know. What I would expect is someone like Daniel Kretinsky to know. And listen, it would be humiliating for David Sullivan and Karen Brady to resign their executive positions. But there has to be a point where even they look at themselves and think, well, actually, no, we can't do this, where they have a bit of realism and actually look at the likes of Brighton and look at the likes of Bournemouth, and I always use those, or Aston Villa, or whatever the case may be, and think, well, actually, these guys are so much better than us. And it is worth noting that I know Aston Villa are a big club and they haven't traditionally spent their time down there, but it wasn't too long ago that Aston Villa were in the league below, were in the Championship. Certainly. Would it be within the last 7 years? Would that be right? I should have checked before, but certainly comfortably within David Sullivan's time at West Ham. And to see these other clubs like Brighton, like Bournemouth come up and actually excel you should be asking yourself, well, what are they doing that I'm not doing? And once you've answered that question, or if you don't, and you can't find a solution to it, or you don't know the answer, then that is the time for thinking, right, okay, things have moved on. I need to probably look. For your own investment, if nothing else. For their own investment, for David Sullivan's own investment, to think, actually, and that's the other thing, for him to think, maybe, my West Ham shares would be worth more money if I put some experts in charge of this club. I think it would. Honestly, I honestly think it would. But anyway, there you go. Those are just my thoughts on it today. But I think this is going to continue to run and run. And there was part of me that thought, actually, this has been really badly timed because of the win against Nottingham Forest. But then the other part of me thinks, actually, this is a good time, because the international break is allowing a debate to cure, basically, to distill, if you want, over over this period where there's actually, you know, a vacuum of other West Ham news there. This keeps it in the news. So actually, I've changed my mind. I actually think, yeah, actually, this is very good timing, actually. Anyway, there you go. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I think things. I don't say things are changing because I think that would be a hell of a claim. But this feels different. And if this gets Daniel Kretinsky's attention, then I do believe that the West Ham board have got a problem on their hands.